1989, BBC had a 2-hour documentary, Fascist Legacy, which tells the story of the British and American cover-up of Italian war crimes. It was based on my research, and I was the principal interviewee. I had my 15 hours of fame until the Berlin Wall fell that evening, and that really put a curtail to all of the publicity on that project. Now, this was a very difficult project for me to undertake because of the fact that I had to say some rather unpleasant things about 3 countries very close to me, the Italians who committed all of these atrocities in the Balkans and in Africa, and the British and Americans who covered it up because they wanted the Italians as allies in the Cold War. Now I have to tell you about another video subject, which is related to the Israeli cover-up of Nazi war criminals, thousands in West Germany and hundreds in the CIA, in exchange for submarines, the German Dolphin submarines, and also the nuclear technology and the financing for this nuclear technology, which was an agreement that was made between Israel and the West Germany in around 1960. Now, the British cover-up, the Israeli cover-up of Nazis for weapons of mass destruction gives us an image of the period, the Nazi period, which is different from the binary choice that we're usually offered. Hollywood gives us a standard image of Israelis as the great heroes trying to uncover Nazis, which is total nonsense. And we also have the Holocaust deniers, very malevolent, sick people who go around claiming that 6 million Jews were never killed. Well, the truth is, Israel is subject to criticism from a completely different direction. Yes, of course there was a Holocaust. But the question is, what did Israel do about the Holocaust? Did Israel go after the guys who committed it? And that is really the subject that has occupied my attention for such a long time. Now, I had my book in the 1980s, The Waldheim Files, where I discussed the Eichmann case and the Waldheim case, which is related to this whole subject of the cover-up of Nazi war criminals by Israel. And this was investigated by Tom Segev, the leading historian and journalist in Israel. And he came to a preliminary conclusion, which was probably justified at that particular time in 1986. And what he said was the prosecution of war criminals was never one of Israel's top priorities. Much was said about it. Little, however, was done. I think that that is a correct statement at that particular time, but now we can go much farther than that. Based on German and Israeli documents and the work of Tom Segev, as well as other leading historians and journalists in Israel, and of course my own research, we now know that there was an agreement between Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister, the father of Israel, and David Ben-Gurion, and Konrad Adenauer, who was the elderly first Chancellor of the West German state. However, West Germany was really being run by his right-hand man, Hans Glubke, who was a Nazi who should have been put on trial. And Hans Glubke was the guy who the Israelis really had to deal with regard to this whole issue of the cover-up of Nazis in exchange for nuclear technology and the submarines, the Dolphin submarines, which are still very important in the Israeli military establishment. Now, as far as the Second World War, there's very new evidence which has been breaking in the past few months, actually, which suggests that the Nazis in World War II were far more advanced in nuclear technology than previously suspected. And indeed, they may have well had some nuclear detonations in the Third Reich just before the fall of Hitler's regime. So, at any rate, I think we can say the Nazis were certainly in a very good position to be of help to the Israelis in their particular nuclear program in Dimona. Now, you can say that this is a project which the Israelis themselves have been very interested in uncovering. And first of all, let me just say, before I proceed further, I apologize in advance if my pronunciation of Hebrew names is not what it should be. I certainly don't mean any disrespect. We have a chap by the name of Shagara Alam, and he wrote an article, Did Ben-Gurion Sell His Soul to Satan? And this particular Israeli scholar claims that claims is probably true, that he spoke to elderly Nazis who were people who had worked on Hitler's bomb, who were in Dimona, the Israeli facility for nuclear research. Then we have Ora Herman, another scholar in Israel, and her book is about the furnace and the reactor. Now, this is about a trial of Adolph Eichmann. Eichmann was a guy who was not associated with the CIA, not associated with West Germany, and he was grabbed by the Israelis and put on trial in 1961. He was grabbed in 1960. The trial was in 1961. I remember watching it as a young person on TV. Now, there are certain things that have to be mentioned about the Eichmann trial, which you'll never get in any particular Hollywood movie or in most of the books on the subject. At the Eichmann trial, there was an agreement that Eichmann would be blamed for everything, and there would be no blame put on the German people, or certainly not the West German government, for the crimes of the Nazis. Number one, any official working for West Germany was not allowed to be mentioned during the Eichmann trial. And the prosecutor made a mistake. They mentioned one guy who was helping Eichmann, and then the BND were the West German security people, roughly equivalent to the CIA or FBI. And no, you can't say that. That guy's working for our government. And, they had to stop the proceedings. Now, we all know that Eichmann was placed in a glass booth. But why was he placed in a glass booth? Well, the main idea was that was not the glass. They said the glass was there to protect him. That's nonsense. The main thing was they wanted soundproofing, because when Eichmann was first grabbed, he thought it was outrageous that they were grabbing him, and yet they were dealing with these other Nazis in West Germany who he considered just as guilty as himself. And so they were afraid, the Israelis were afraid, and the West Germans were afraid, that Eichmann was going to start blurting all the names of all the Nazis in West Germany, most especially Hans Glubke, who was really running the country. The other thing about the Eichmann trial was they were very quick to exonerate the German people during the Nazi regime. They made statements about this opposition to Hitler. Well, there was really no opposition to Hitler. If you read the notes of the DNB West German security people, they considered that to be nonsense. And, of course, they had to say very pleasant things about the government of West Germany and the people of West Germany, in terms of making it clear that they were not held responsible for what was going on what had gone on during the Nazi period. Now, who showed up at the trial was very interesting. Some of you may have been familiar with the character of Oskar Schindler. Well, there really was an Oskar Schindler, and he really did show up at the Eichmann trial for propaganda purposes. And, of course, the West German newspapers, originally the Israeli newspapers lauded him as an example of the new Germany and, things of that nature. Unfortunately, when Oskar Schindler got back to Germany, the Germans spit him in the face as a Jew lover. So, you see, all of it was just nonsensical propaganda. Now, I want to say something. I have to say something about the movie Schindler's List. Perhaps maybe it deserves a video in and of itself. But I think there's something very shameful about that movie, in the sense that the theme of the movie is there were good Nazis and bad Nazis, but all Polish people who were not Jewish were scum. They were just a bunch of collaborators. They were just a bunch of people. The only non-Jewish Poles you see in the movie are prostitutes, black market people, everyone who is collaborating with the Nazis. They don't tell you that almost as many non-Jewish Poles were murdered by the Nazis, and that indeed it was Nazi plan, General Plan East, to wipe out 85% of the Polish population and reduce the other 15% to slaves of the German occupiers. All of that is not even hinted at and not even suggested. So currently we have a debate between people accusing the Polish people of having complicity as collaborators with Nazis. The truth is, the collaborators with the Nazis were not the Polish people. It was Israel who covered up the Nazis, who killed their own people as well as the Polish people in exchange for weapons of mass destruction. Now there's another movie coming out about the Eichmann trial, which is expected to come out in Hollywood in fall of 2018, and they will have their own Hollywood fantasies about the Eichmann trial, and I'm sure they're not going to mention anything about the cover-up of Nazis during that particular legal proceedings. Now, I want to mention that this was quite noticeable that at the Eichmann trial, there was a cover-up of Nazis. The leading intellectual in Israel, Professor Yeshua Leibowitz, attended the trial, and he left in disgust. He was a pretty smart guy. He had a reputation of being the smartest guy in Israel, and he proved it because he walked out of the Eichmann trial, and when they interviewed him, he said, "I think it was a conspiracy between Ben-Gurion and Adenauer to clear the name of the German people. In return, they paid us billions." Well, that was true. What he may or may not have known was about the business about the billions was for the building of nuclear weapons, possibly aided by Hitler's scientists. Now, Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, tried to put the best face about negotiating with a Nazi like Glubke. And Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary, "Glubke, the man closest to Adenauer, behaves all right, despite the fact that he wrote commentaries to the Nuremberg laws." The Nuremberg laws were what set off the Holocaust. That was the beginning, the first step. This guy was involved in that. And Ben-Gurion and his guys had to sit there and negotiate with this Nazi. And they said, well, he behaved well. Why did he behave well? He didn't give the Nazi salute. He didn't say, "Jews, line up for deportation, put all your belongings on the platform." He didn't say stuff like that. So Ben-Gurion said he was acting all right. I think perhaps Ben-Gurion should have expected a somewhat higher standard than that. Now, was there really a cover-up? Well, I've been involved in many books and many different documentary films, and certainly the German documents make clear that there was, in fact, a cover-up that was being paid for. And Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss wrote, "I have told my Israeli contacts that it is a matter of course that if the Federal Republic of Germany supports the security of Israel, it will not be held, it, meaning the Federal Republic of Germany, will not be held collectively responsible, morally, politically, journalistically, for the crimes of the past generation in connection with the Eichmann trial." Now, that is a clear indication of what really was going on and what the Germans expected. Glubke himself wrote his negotiations with the Israelis was extremely arrogant, and the man had so much chutzpah. He told the Israelis, "Well, I'm gonna make sure you're not gonna get anything until after the Eichmann trial. We have to make sure how this goes, because after all, we have to wait a while. We don't want people to get, quote, the wrong impression that there's some connection between what we're giving you and what you are giving us in return." Now, working on this particular video, I was working on another project unrelated, and I happened to be reading the work of a former professor of mine at the City University, Hans Morgenthau, who wrote this rather important book, Politics Among Nations, the Six Principles. Some of you who studied poli-sci may know about his 6 principles of international relations. And Hans Morgenthau was the great believer in realism in international relations. Now, at that time, when he was teaching at City University and I was studying for my PhD, Hans Morgenthau was extraordinarily close to Hannah Arendt. Now, who is Hannah Arendt? Some of you may know her from another Hollywood movie. She wrote a book about the Eichmann trial. And indeed, Hannah Arendt and Hans Morgenthau traveled to Israel on several occasions, and she undoubtedly must have spoken to him about the Eichmann trial, which is probably her most famous book. Now, in the book and in the Hollywood movie, she never mentions anything about the cover-up of Nazis in exchange for weapons of mass destruction. But I just wonder if would it just be interesting to have overheard their private conversations, because I'm sure that they discuss this particular matter. Now, for me, it seems, and I say this in great respect for my former professor, that the Faustian bargain that the Israelis made of covering up Nazis in exchange for weapons of mass destruction most certainly must be considered history's most outrageous example of realpolitik in international relations. In the following part 2, I'm going to continue this story and include this, my own personal experiences. I discovered 35,000 war crime files. The Israelis threatened to kill me. The Israeli embassy in New York to the United Nations. Netanyahu was the Benjamin Netanyahu. You may have heard of him. By the time you see this video, he may be in jail. But the point is, Benjamin Netanyahu at that time was the UN ambassador to Israel, and he was involved in the cover-up of Nazis, and I have a New York Times story and all kinds of coverage of this, that probably his role in the cover-up of Nazis was indeed his greatest crime.